Hello everyone, I'm very pleased to welcome Brent Waters, who is the Emeritus Chair of Christian Ethics at Stead Center for Christian Social Ethics at Garrett Theological Seminary. And we're here to talk about his latest book, Common Callings and Ordinary Virtues. And so Brent, welcome. Thank you for coming. So Brent is a fellow of the James M. Houston Center for Humanity and the Common Good. And he's our guest today. And so I just wanted to start by asking you if you could tell us a little about the your kind of intellectual formation that led up to your becoming this interested in Christian social ethics and the writing of this book. You know, this kind of thing, like what texts, people, places, events formed you in the way that you're arguing here.
Well, the first thing was I began to think back, what do I do as a Christian ethicist? And I realized I spent an awful lot of time thinking about abstract ideas and larger-than-life events that I never had any first-hand experience in, and that basically I ignored where I lived and where I worked. And I thought there's just something fundamentally wrong about that. You know, what's the importance of the ordinary, and why should I just ignore that? But what really brought it to a head was a personal experience. Was as you know, I was sick for about a month. Spent a month in the hospital, and
quite sick. I mean,
yes, yeah. I mean, in the rehab, I was learning how to feed myself again, how to walk, and all this. And I realized the absolute dependence I had upon nurses, and it was just ordinary stuff. I mean, they helped me go to the restroom. They helped me eat. They helped. And I thought, okay, maybe it is intending to the ordinary, to the mundane, is how we exhibit a love of neighbor, because we just overlook that, and yet it's terribly important. So those were the two events, and then I thought, okay, but how do you write about this? And I think there's two challenges. One is, because by ordinary and mundane, I mean mind-numbing, boring stuff. I'm not even going to try to make it interesting, and in fact, if you do try to make it interesting, they be no longer formative. But how do you write about that? Because if it's that boring, who's going to read about it? And yet if you try to make it interesting, then it's no longer mundane. And so you got to find that balance. But the second thing was, who are some people I need to use on this? So two influential people in my thinking. Oliver O'Donovan, because he was also my professor.
Right.
But he provided a theological structure for this by his concept that he's written recently on entering into rest. And by that it means I think you reach a point in life where you begin to say, okay, it's time for me to kind of step back to enable others to celebrate the lives of others. And it's not so much that you stop doing things, you just do them differently. And you really celebrate the other, which means you also have to be kind of attentive to them and understand who they are. And that's where Iris Murdoch comes in. Because she was a trained philosopher, but was more, wrote far more novels than she wrote philosophy. I think there's only 4 or 5 texts in formal philosophy, but 25 novels. And she has this concept that she kind of borrowed from Simone Weil of unselfing.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. And what I think is important about that is, personally, I think she has the most memorable line written in 20th century moral philosophy. And she says that the enemy of moral excellence is the fat, relentless ego. And so that ego gets in the way of everything, so you have to unself in order to see the other as other. And that's where and that's how you begin to attend to their needs. And I'm not saying that taking care of yourself is not important, but I think sometimes we spend too much time defining everything in reference to ourselves, when that means that the other simply becomes a projection of what we want them to be rather than who they are.
And this unselfing, that's so central to your book. How do we unself? Like, how do you unself, and how in our present culture are there things conducive to unselfing, or are there mostly obstacles to unselfing? I know you've also written much about technology and so on, so maybe you can expand into that a little bit.
I'll start with this is where I think the mundane and the ordinary is important, because it helps put the ego on a diet. Because when you really concentrate on the ordinary, you begin to realize how unimportant you really are. So what really hit me was when I finally became a father, and I'm changing a diaper, and I was really upset because this little infant doesn't realize how important her father is. Here I am, a trained theologian, and I'm desperately trying to change this diaper, and she doesn't care. All she needs is that diaper changed. And so to really tend for the other, you have to kind of put your sense of self-importance to the side and really attend, because that's what they need at that moment. Or if someone's sick, they don't need a lecture. They need a glass of water. And you have to be attentive to that. And I think sometimes we get so absorbed with ourselves, we just fail to notice what the other person needs. And oftentimes it's very simple things. I think the technology tries to create a fabrication that we're somehow all extraordinary.
Okay, yeah.
And that gets in the way too. That just feeds the ego rather than helping to place it in the proper. And
is it ironic? I mean, it tries to tell us that we're all extraordinary, but in the sense the way that things are mediated through, a curated social media in certain shapes and forms that are standard for everybody. I mean, what we think is an extraordinary really is
right.
Is not ordinary in the good sense of the use of it. It becomes trite. I mean, it becomes, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so it's, and I think that's behind the notion that basically on Facebook, for example, you present yourself as you want others to see you. I mean, you rarely have people just say, my life is miserable, which you really, unless they want sympathy. But what they're really trying to, the reason I don't like Facebook is that it reminds me of being back in high school and trying to get to the cool table again. So you're projecting yourself in a certain kind of way that you really are not, and you have to make yourself look extraordinary.
One of the things I found intriguing is you use cooking in the book as an example of, I think, most everything, a kind of unselfing, learning attendance or attending to things, learning to see the importance of the ordinary. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How do you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's several things. Like maybe 10, 12 years ago, I took up cooking as a hobby, and then I started doing more of the cooking. I didn't see that one coming, but you begin to realize what an ordinary process is of preparing and eating a meal, but you also have to be attentive to what you're doing. I mean, because what I learned very quickly is almost anything in the kitchen is potentially dangerous. So if you're not paying attention, you can cut yourself, you can injure yourself, whatever. So pay attention to what you're doing. But I also found that even when you're just in a kitchen preparing a meal alone, you can be attentive to the notion, or at least acknowledge how dependent you are on the efforts of others. Very mundane things, again, planning the food, bringing it to market, getting it ready so that you can purchase it, bring it home and do it.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing in an ordinary meal, though, is that where it does, I think, in some sense, become at least iconic, that you can see, is that a meal is just not for eating; it's for fellowship. It's dining is what the practice is, and it enables that. But a lot of ordinary activities go into making that extraordinary meal.
So do you use? I was wondering about mundane. From the Latin has a bit of a theological connotation, right? In mundus, do you use them interchangeably? Is mundane and the ordinary, are those the same, or do you make any distinction, or are they?
No, I didn't make the distinction. In fact, I had no idea what its roots were until this very moment. So,
okay.
No, in fact, okay. One of the things you learn early on as an author is that almost never do your title stick, because the marketing department gets a hold of it and says, well, we can't sell this. So my original subtitle was not Christian Ethics for Everyday Life. That was changed. My original subtitle was In Praise of the Mundane.
Okay.
And I was just basically told, well, no one's going to buy a book that's praising the mundane, because of the connotations. But that's really what I wanted to say, is that there's this whole aspect of life that we ignore, but it's actually where we spend most of our time.
So one other way, tell me if I'm wrong, I want to describe the book, is it really is in some ways about virtue formation through the mundane. How does the mundane shape us in a good way, in a virtuous way. And maybe you can even connect this to the idea of good life that is hovering in all of this. And I know you keep saying that you're an Augustinian, so but yeah, how does the mundane? Because we tend to talk about virtue formation as a kind of asceticism that needs to be consciously, and laboriously, and it's a struggle, and we need the sanctifying power of the Spirit to do all these kind of things. But you're really talking about formation through the mundane, ordinary things of life that shape us while we're not aware of it. In some ways, right? That's what it's ordinary, right? But so can you talk about that? I'm wondering how that hangs together.
Yeah, you're right. The book is not a theory of virtue formation. What I want to talk about is what prepares us for the more formal process that you were describing.
Yeah.
And this is where I think and this is why I call it ordinary, common callings, ordinary virtues. They are extraordinarily ordinary, but they do form habits which can orient us then toward virtue. So, for example, a lot of people have been surprised I wrote a chapter on manners, and I understand manners can be misused. They can be misused to keep people in their place, kind of thing. But manners are also a way that we show respect for one another. It's also a way of putting strangers at ease because there's rules about conduct and that sort of thing. It's also a way to civilize a meal, basically, because when you think about it, preparation of a meal is an extraordinarily violent activity. Look at all the language that you have in recipes. Slice, dice, bludgeon, and whether it's vegetables or meat, there's a lot of destructive or violent activity going on. Mm-hmm. So when you finally share the meal, you don't want that continuing on, or so that's where the manners come in. What are the table manners? What are just the daily ways that we treat one another? So also, I wrote a chapter on appearance. Is that how you project yourself to others indicates to them the level of respect that you hold them. So the example I use in the book is that if I show up to my class every day in jeans and a dirty T-shirt, I'm making a statement of the esteem that I hold my students in. So that's why I consciously dressed up when I went to class. I wanted to say I think you're important. So now I'm not going to quiz your students on how you show up to class, but.
Because they might conversely just think you're stuck up or something.
Could. And that may be true as well. But I think the appearance chapter, what I found interesting, at least when I was putting it together, is that it's ordinary and mundane, but I think it's also theological from the standpoint that all we have is appearance, because we really can't see to the inward soul of the person. Only God can do that, and it's the notion of persona.
Yeah. I was just sticking with the example of cooking and food and preparing a meal. I really liked how you also immediately made that a communal activity, right? That means you have the meal and you invite people over for a meal. And that's in some way a mundane action of hospitality, but your emphasis on attentiveness in all of that. You have to attend to the cooking of the meal, you go through the labor, but you also do it for... You have in mind the people that you're preparing this for, and then you want to invite them in this gesture of hospitality in a way that they don't feel. I think you even say that they shouldn't feel obligated to clean up afterwards,
right?
Because that would kind of be like, I'm paying for this. Right? It's no longer free hospitality.
Right.
Did that just come to you, these ideas, or is this what you do? Is that what you?
Well, it's through a variety of sources. Number one, I reached a point in life where I really appreciate a good host or hostess.
Yeah.
The people that are really good at it, they draw you into conversation. They put you at ease. They let you know that you're here to enjoy the evening. Don't worry about the details. But also in literature, you look at like in Iris Murdoch, the extraordinary detail of attention to the details about the meal and the interactions of the conversations. Or someone like F. Scott Fitzgerald. One of my favorite literary characters is Jay Gatsby, and the attention he gives to throwing the party. He doesn't attend them, but he loves throwing the party and inviting people into it. So that's what came of that, and it also like the experience we had last night. The reception was very important to that evening.
Yeah.
Because it kind of set the mood for what followed.
And now you're a theologian, so do you consciously construct these or reflect on these things with an eye to divine hospitality? Is that
yeah? I mean, I think the Eucharist is a foretaste of the eternal banquet in heaven, where we finally sit at table, in fellowship with one another and with God.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comparison to me, because I was thinking this the other day. I was teaching theology, and I have an image. I think we're teaching Irenaeus, and Irenaeus uses the Eucharist often as a pledge for the proof of his theology. And the cup that's displayed, I found a picture somewhere, the cup is displayed, the Eucharistic cup, and Christ is in the cup, and he has his hands outstretched like this. And the fathers often talk about his hands outstretched on the cross, meaning he's inviting the whole world in every dimension, but also every group. And that sense of hospitality. So, what about the host you don't, the guests you don't know? Like Derrida's concept of radical hospitality, right? You don't ask, you invite everybody, and if you start discerning, you're no longer properly hospitable. So, is there a process there of discerning of?
Yeah, I think you do. It is a discernment, and it's an art. It's not a technique. I mean, I remember one time my employer decided that it was time that we should become a more hospitable institution. And we had a number of meetings on how to be hospitable. So it became kind of a technique. And I mentioned finally, I said, for a shy person like me, the most hospitable thing you could do is leave me alone.
Yeah.
And you have to learn, I think, the cues of the people that you're trying to be hospitable to. Is that what does really constitute hospitality?
Yeah.
And
that's interesting. Yeah. I find it interesting because there's, as people at this institution here know, most of my theological reflection has, in one way or another, be pushed to the grid of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theology. But he has this really interesting statement he made to his seminary students, who always complained, or some of them complained, that he wasn't warm enough, and he said to some of them who he knew more intimately, "Why don't you just leave me the way I am? Why can't you just take me, the way I am? Just what you just said. It's the same thing. It's just my personality. Can't you just accept that? In terms of."
Yeah, and I think
hospitality. Yeah.
And I think it's also an exhibition of neighbor love, is to genuinely enjoy the other as other who is going to remain a mystery to you, and that's just part of it. And in the short story and in the movie, A River Runs Through It, there's a really powerful line where the Presbyterian minister's younger son has been murdered because of gambling debts. And he never really recovers, and years later they're at his final sermon. And he has this line where he doesn't mention his son, but it's obviously on his mind that we come to love fully those we can never fully understand. And I think that that's part of, the habits that you form, is beginning to see the other as other. Mm-hmm. And it's something that ultimately you cannot manipulate or change.
So that beautiful line takes us to another central theme in your book, which is friendship. So in all of this context of formation through the ordinary, and helping us to become oriented that way to the good life, friendships plays a major role. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, no, I think friendship, it used to be that was a major category of moral theology, moral philosophy, and it kind of dropped out of favor because friendship, I think, was trivialized as being somewhat of a, it's someone you had a good time with, but that was maybe the extent of it, And then I think social media really trivialized it, where you can easily friend or defriend or whatever it's called, and it's just
unfriend me, please.
But I think friendship is extraordinarily important, because I think very few people become friends, and yet you hold one another accountable, because you want the best for the other, and the other needs help and needs fellowship in doing that. And I think the nice thing is that friends will tell you the truth. They're not going to. What I find really interesting in something like Polycraticus by John Salisbury is he warns the king in my favorite chapter on flatterers and toadies. These are the people you need to avoid because they want to kill you. Because it's the first justification of tyrannicide where he says, a tyrant isn't owed the truth. So if you flatter them, you're really reserving the right to kill them. And I think it's not that extreme now, but we should be leery of people that flatter us.
Yeah.
Because those aren't your friends. Friends are not going to flatter you. They're going to be, neither will they abandon you. There's also the question of loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
And I think friendship's rare, but it's important.
So if you have a good friend, the question is really if he is true to his, I don't want to say function, but what the purpose is to do in this, to tell you the truth. The real question is whether you're able to take it.
Yes,
because you could close yourself off and says, well, I don't like you as much anymore because you're actually constant in your role as a friend, but I don't want to hear the truth because I just like to delude myself for now.
Right, but if you're really dedicated to friendship, then you realize that person's doing exactly what he should be doing.
Yeah. If I recall correctly, I may be wrong. You go through various figures here in the friendship chapter, starting with some ancient philosophy. Can you just be interested? Maybe people might be interested in the differences how these people viewed friendship. Like I think, do you talk about Aristotle and Augustine? Like, what are the differences there?
Well, the differences there is that basically, in the ancient world, only an equal could be a friend. So, for example, given the context of the day, spouses could never be friends because they weren't equal. And I think that notion just isn't viable anymore, and for good reasons. I think it's an incomplete understanding of what friendship is. Now, I think there's still some residue left over that we need to be. That's not the best word, but you know what I mean. There's some leftover import to that. That, for example, the relationship between professor and student is not really. I hope it's friendly, but it really can't be friends because there is that sense of a power differential there. Yeah. And what I noticed was my general rule is I don't care what students call me as long as I can repeat it at home. Okay. And what I found interesting was the differences of how, some called me by my first name the first day. Yeah. But the students that probably did the best were very reserved. And it wasn't until they had achieved their degree that then and only then did they address me by my first name. Mm-hmm. It was like, suddenly the transition was there. So I think that even there, what friendship acknowledges is that there's a certain kind of loyalty to one another. Now, I think, again, I'm not real big on the equality because, I think, it can be sometimes you have a very good friendship between an older and younger person. And I don't think it's as neat and tidy as the ancients thought. That's the difference.
Maybe a couple of final questions on the friendship thing. How is the interhuman friendship different from our friendship with God? Like, I was struck by, again, the ancient theologians' insistence that that's really, so the result of the gospel is almost like twofold. Like, one is the marvelous gaining of immortality, and deification by becoming Christ-like. But the other is this astounding fact that we're now friends with God, like the friendship with God. But it seems so, there seems to be, though, an ontological difference, right? There's this God's friendship with us. And do you see any differences here between the friendship, divine human friendship, and the human friendship?
I do. Quite frankly, I find it a little bit perplexing that you can claim a friendship with God this side of eternity. If you were to ask me, is God my friend, I'd have to say not yet. And so there's a kind of, moving into the divine presence that I think then maybe the friendship comes in. But it's only after I get through the day of judgment, in a sense. Whereas I think with friends with other people is more immediate, because they don't stand in the same position that God stands over and against. So, no, I think there is a difference, and sometimes I find it's a little bit too casual on how
it can be that,
on how friendly. It's almost as if some people when they pray to God, it's like, they start off by saying, "Hey, big guy," and I just don't think there's that casualness.
No, I totally agree with that. At the same time, I was always, someone like Gregor of Nyssa will simply say, like, this is one of the most beautiful things right in the life of Moses, is our friendship with God. There's a paragraph that I had on my office door for a while because I was so struck by how he would formulate it. But maybe the thing is, if we actually invested, like if I have, like say you were my best friend, and I would, for the duration of our friendship here on earth, I would always be amazed at the fact that somebody like you actually is my friend, And maybe it's something like that, with so you don't cheapen it by taking it for granted ever.
Right.
And then the final one is in the book Common Callings. You choose C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. So you could tell you're really getting into that, like a test case for friendship. Why did you pick those? How did you hit on those? And what do they show us in terms of friendship? Maybe they can summarize this stuff. Some of what you've been saying.
The friendships, they wax and wane over time.
Yeah.
And that's happened with Lewis and
so how did that go in their case?
Well, they're colleagues and they're trying to reform the English department, and they get together. The Inklings, they eat together, they take walks together. It's very intimate, very close. And then C.S. Lewis marries Joy, and Tolkien just can't understand why this is, in the first place, even permissible, because she's a divorced woman, and with his Catholic faith, this is not permissible. Yeah. And they do kind of draw away from each other.
Yeah.
But the friendship is never broken entirely.
Yeah.
And it's reported that the day that Tolkien learned that Lewis had died, that he was deeply grieved by that. There was a loss here.
Yeah.
But they also hold each other accountable. Lewis encouraged Tolkien. It's reported that one night at the Inklings, you have to clean up the language a little bit, but Tolkien wants to start reading something, and someone says, "Oh, not another elf," and he was deeply hurt by this, and was thinking, and then maybe I should stop writing about this stuff. And it's Lewis saying, "No, this is important. You have to keep writing." And there's that kind of encouragement too that I think comes with friendship.
Mm-hmm.
And then, is it a test case? Yeah, but not all of us have that kinds of friendship, but I think it's a good one to look at.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe one other, going back to the ordinary extraordinary pair. You write in the book, you say, I'll just quote you here briefly. Sorry, I have to read this off. The late modern technoculture in which we live and work, you say, is fixated on the extraordinary. So where do you think this fixation comes from? And do you see ways in which people in church or elsewhere are creatively resisting this fixation? Or are we actually in the church, taking on the same fascination with the extraordinary?
Yeah, I think some churches are caught up in it, so that even worship is kind of transformed into an entertaining spectacle rather than worship.
Yeah. So rather than the mundane of the liturgy, maybe, or yeah.
Right. And liturgy is mundane. It's repetitive. Week in, week out, it's the same words, but and that's what I think is formative about it, is its sheer repetitiveness, so that you don't necessarily go to church expecting to be entertained, expecting something new. I remember I used Stanley Hauerwas in this, and I would teach my students, don't try to make worship meaningful, because that's not what it's about. Because worship is the only reason you're there is to worship God, and how can you possibly create meaning for God? Mm-hmm. So it's really what it is worship is a way, I think, of forming ourselves in ways that are receptive to grace, receptive to God's leading, and these kinds of activities. So again, what I find is when that really becomes imprinted upon you, it's just a remarkable thing that happens, and you're not even aware of it. It's just part of it. There, a real quick illustration I'll give of this is that increasingly I was using novels to teach ethics, because it's a way to trick people into thinking theologically, and they don't know it until it's too late. And I was using a certain kind of novel from a Canadian, Marina Endicott, And one night I was starting to close down the computer, and I got an email from her. And she said, I was Googling something else, but your syllabus popped up. Why are you using my book in a seminary course? And I explained, well, I needed a novel that shows that the moral life is messy, and your book's about as messy as I could find on this topic. And she wrote back and she said, I'm no longer a practicing Christian, but I'm the daughter of an Anglican rector. And when you sit through the Eucharistic liturgy 4 times every Sunday, it becomes part of you. And she said, if you'll notice in the book, I follow the liturgy of the Eucharist. And then she kind of spelled it out chapter by chapter and told me to give it to the class. And it was just beautiful. And it was just, that whole movement through that.
So that's really interesting. And I don't want to, there's the second part of the question we haven't really gotten to yet, is where do you think this fixation comes from for the extraordinary? But I want to just stay just 1 second, because while you were talking, yes, the liturgy is mundane, and at the same time it is sacramental. It's a means of grace, and the discrepancy between this. So is the mundane suffused somehow by the divine, or used by the divine in a kind of formation that is healthy? Because so the first time I read, and people who had this experience, when you read Alexander Zimmermann on the liturgy, you just think, wow, everything is short, like everything is so meaningful, right? Everything is drawing us into the divine, like it's drawing us into sacred time. It's drawing us in some ways out of the mundane, but in a way that is sacramental. So it's actually the mundane that becomes suffused with the divine and is given back to God. And therefore points to the new creation, which is already invading it. And I remember finishing the work and thinking, yeah, but really, like everybody who goes to the Orthodox liturgy, like has that all in mind. Like they're like we're walking into this palace sprinkled with fairy dust. That's just taking us up, and we know that every moment that this is happening. I don't think so. But so how would you articulate that? Like, is the liturgy, which is in some ways very repetitive, is mundane, and we kind of do it unthinkingly, but it's still working, right? I mean, it's still somehow doing a divine work, no?
No, I think that's right. But I would put it differently. Yes, I think that's okay. Why do most people come to church? And I think we in the seminary, we'd like to believe that they have all this spiritual insight. When in fact they do it primarily out of custom and obligation. Okay. Mm. And there's nothing wrong with that. Again, you mentioned I'm Augustinian. Yeah, I like Augustine because he's the great defender of mediocre Christians, and that mediocrity is the mainstay of the church. And that's not I'm not condemning it. It's just basically that's the reality. But I think that in the liturgy at times, and in the common and in the ordinary, it becomes iconic in the sense that we see through it and we gain, however briefly, an insight into eternity, mm-hmm. into the really extraordinary, and into love itself. And those moments are rare and they're fleeting. But I think liturgy, just again, through the way it unconsciously forms us, prepares us to see that when the opportunity arises.
So you put another topic in my head, which is love, which you say is extraordinary, and that is ordinary. Okay, well, we got to go there, but I still want to hear from you. Why this fixation on the extraordinary in our culture? And you say in the book that this is in part to take us back to that, the transhumanist dream, right? This fascination with the extraordinary, achievable through technology. But why do you think in late modernity we have this fascination with the extraordinary?
Because I think late moderns are inherently bored.
Okay.
That technology, if it does nothing else, what it does very well is it dulls us. It's an invitation to become sleepwalkers.
Yeah. But so, how does that work? So there's a fascination with the extraordinary to technology, which really leads you to, in the end, a pretty boring atrophied version of what is humanity. I suppose the people who are into the world of the metaverse, where everything, potentially you can become anything, right? I mean, you could potentially fly, you can do it.
Right.
That sounds probably way more exciting than the mundane that you're describing in the book.
Well, I think what late modernity did was it dulled us because it disenchanted the world, and technology is very good at that. But then you have to re-enchant it with something. But what technology offers are counterfeit enchantments. So it's not that it really sparks the imagination; it does all the work for you as well.
Yeah.
So I remember one of the most interesting things was Ken Burns did a documentary on radio, and the last scene is they're interviewing a 7 or 8 year old boy, late 40s. An interviewer says, "Young man, does your family have that new invention called television?" He says, "Oh yes, sir. It's in the living room." And he says, "And do you watch it every night?" And he says, "No, sir." And he says, "Well, what do you do?" He says, "I listen to the radio." And he says, "Why?" And he says, "Because the pictures are better." And I think that's more revealing than we realize, because there is an imaginative act going on that requires your engagement.
Yeah.
Where technology now is you're always the recipient of something that is bombarding you. You don't have to do the hard work of imagination.
Yeah.
So I think really what technology deprives us of, in the best sense of the word, is a good mythology, and tries to replace it with a cheap counterfeit.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a number of. I'm still not sure what to make of this whole virtual world thing into which you escape. I suppose it becomes more exciting because there's limitless self-expression, which is another late modern fascination. At the same time, I often thought, when some of the earlier transhumanist dreams of, so we're all becoming disembodied versions of ourselves, and we connect up in the cloud, and we have this limitless, universal communication. Even the description I found so utterly boring, because it is disembodied, because it bears none of the risk of encounter, and it's stripped of anything that makes you different in the end, right? I mean, you're just all these same disembodied kind of. It's a bizarre thing. But I want to come back to like two more questions maybe. One is on love. So love is. I mean, Augustine would be the first thing to say, love is extraordinary. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. It's maybe the most difficult thing to do. It's the most sacrificial thing. It's the most risky thing. It's extraordinary in every way of the word. And yet you say it is also, it's central to your argument for the mundane. So how do you put these two together? Is it ordinary? Is it extraordinary? What is it?
Yes. I mean, it's both. I mean, look, if you want to summarize the Christian faith, it's those two great commandments: you love God and you love neighbor, and all the law and the prophets hang upon this. And I think that's right, but love, and I think this is what transhumanism makes it so dangerous, is they want to create a world which is essentially risk-free. Mm. If you eliminate risk, you also eliminate love. So what they really are dedicated to is of creating a loveless world. Are we diminished? Yeah, I think we are. In that, I'm not arguing for recklessness, but I am arguing for the necessity of risk. Because I think the closest synonym to faith is not belief; it's gambling. What are you betting your life on? What are you risking in this love of God? What are you risking in this love of neighbor? And you're risking your heart may be broken, you may be disappointed. It may not be what you think it to be, and yet really what you're risking is suffering.
Yeah, that is powerful, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I've certainly, what you've just articulated, you've certainly seen this through the pandemic, where we were obviously willing to give over the risk for safety, and therefore to abandon love just for the preservation of what the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben has called bare life. You split the holistic human life, which is spirit, and all this dimension that you've talked about, the interhuman dimension of love and so on. You split it from the biological life, and we somehow seem to have been happy to preserve just biological health and sacrifice everything else to that safety. So that during the lockdowns particularly, I mean, the tragic scenes that you could see all over the place of people isolated in old folks' homes, just a hand at the window at best. I know that they've given, in some care homes, they've given, slightly demented people that had slight dementia they need to see their spouse. They can't do with a tablet, or even a phone call was just barely possible, in terms of so yeah, I mean, it's an interesting time that we've been going against exactly what you said, right? We no longer the risk of love, no the risk of encounter. And I know for a fact that some elderly have told me personally, I'd rather risk infection if it means I can get to see and touch my relations. And why can't that be my choice?
Right.
Anyway, it's a fascinating topic. I want to finish, Brent, by asking you that ultimately the need for the mundane is, the way you put it, is a crucial part of what it means to be truly human, fully human being. And so, just to finish off here, what words of advice or wisdom? I know what you're going to say, that you don't have any, but I don't believe that. So, what words of advice or wisdom could you offer to us here? We're here at Theological College today, to the average graduate student in theology, or even in the humanities more broadly. What would you say that might give us a richer sense of what it is to be human? After you've written this book and you've thought about that.
Well, my first advice to all graduate students in theology is always do what your supervisor tells you to do. Okay, so that's
thank you. Did I tell you? Yes, you did.
But the second thing is, here's where you should be deeply suspicious. Anytime someone says that you're going to be doing something original, don't believe it. You're not here to do originality. You're here really to master what has been given to you, and to become familiar with that. I mean, it's there's nothing worse than poor originality. And what you're really here is for a kind of sacred copying of how do you copy your life to Christ in theology, and that's more important than trying to give some kind of original account of what that might mean. I mean, that's why I think we've finally gotten over turning everything into a theology of. I mean, I'd like to see someone write a book on the theology of theology, and just let it go at that, because it's here to really become and drink deeply of the tradition to be formed by that.
Yeah.
So, but it also tends to the ordinary. I mean, I think a lot of times, sometimes graduate students, neglect things like you still need your friendships. You still need to take care of yourself. You actually still need to eat, things like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for this good work. And just keep modeling the mundane and friendship as you do.
Oh, it's pretty easy for me to be ordinary.
That's good.
All right.